To give the context of where this story is based, I live in a smallish college town, near a small to medium-sized city. The town itself doesn't have a lot of people, and is mostly here to cater to the demand that comes from the college. Because of this, the stores around the college are mostly open 24/7, so that the college kids will be able to impulse buy whatever they like. The other big seller around here is gas. Of course, gas can be bought in the city, but being a town that is often gone through in order to get to the city, a lot of places will try to keep the price of gas slightly lower than any of the other stations in the city. My story begins when I was working night shifts at the gas station and liquor store, when I was doing part-time classes in college, but mostly doing classes online, so they wouldn't ruin my availability for a full-time job. The store that I worked at had only one person working on night shifts for a long time, even though a lot of people, especially girls, would complain of a lack of cameras and the fact that you don't always get the best people going into the liquor store and gas station in the middle of the night. The owner's hand was forced one night, before I had started working there, when a woman came in to buy milk, went outside her car, only for a man to come up behind her and shove a gun into her back demanding her money. She complied with him and luckily he let her go. She ran into the store, sobbing hysterically, and though police arrived shortly after, he was never found. I personally preferred having two people on, even if there wasn't a safety issue. The nights seemed to go by so much quicker when there was someone else there, and it was really nice that the person I normally closed with, and I got along with them well. Overall, there were 4 night shift workers: Josh, Nick, Dixie, and myself. Dixie had another job and was only really working there as a favour to one of the managers, so she would only work 2 nights a week with either Josh or I. Josh and I worked together 3 nights a week, and Nick worked with Josh or I 2 nights a week. Dixie was really nice and fun to be around, but she didn't particularly like the job or want to be there. Josh would get annoyed with her a lot for just standing behind the register while he did all the work. But it was only 1 night a week, so he didn't complain too much. Nick, on the other hand, was a bit different. He worked there 5 days a week, just like Josh and I, but they never seemed to put him with one person more than 1 day a week. Nobody seemed to really like him or liked working with him. Nick was a little off from the start. He was one of those people who told you his entire life story as soon as he met you, giving a bunch of really personal details that no one was really comfortable with hearing. One thing he always seemed to talk about was the strain on his marriage. Apparently he had a really bad drinking and drug problem for a very long time, and the drug part got better when he could switch over to weed, but he couldn't seem to get his drinking under control. He was hard to be around, but you kind of get used to some people and that kind of job being so sketchy. I was there for almost 3 months when Nick's story seemed to escalate out of nowhere. He began telling people that he was younger. He was diagnosed as a psychopath, and he had been taking a bunch of pills for it every day so he wouldn't become violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're alone with in the middle of the night, but okay, we all have our problems, and some people get dealt a bad hand when it comes to mental illness. I, myself, have always struggled to get my anxiety and depression under control, and without medicine, I wouldn't be killing people by any means, but I'd probably be hospitalised in danger to self categories. So, as creepy as that was, I assured him that a lot of people need to take medicine for some kind of illness, and as long as you stick to it and are honest with the medical professionals, there's no reason you still can't do anything anyone else can do. He seemed pleased with this answer, and soon after the subject was turned to other things. He was especially cheery and nice to me after that for the next week or so, letting me know daily that he was taking his medicine and felt like things were going well with them. I always answered enthusiastically, but I'm pretty sure everyone, especially Josh, was aware of how much I wished he would stop talking to me about it and would leave me alone. Josh had a wife and daughter who was 2 at the time, so he couldn't help but see us younger girls through the eyes of what his daughter might potentially have to deal with when she was our age, and seemed to go out of his way to end my conversations with Nick rather quickly, which I was grateful for, and he didn't really try to pretend that he liked Nick. It wasn't long before Nick started conversations with me going into details about why he was diagnosed, which I wouldn't get into here because a lot of it is very violent and sexual. I told him repeatedly that I didn't want to know about it. He would act like he understood and change the subject, only for him to circle back to it about an hour later. When I confided to Dixie about it, she told me she would take care of it and told her friend, which was the manager who asked her to come work there. The manager couldn't really do much, since I seemed to be the only one that he would talk to about these things, and told me to come to see her again if he ever made me feel uncomfortable. It was starting to get increasingly tense for everyone working with him. After he was talked to by the manager, and soon after 2 other women who worked there with the night shift reported comments he was making, I was questioned, in which I agreed that all of the statements made by the women were similar to things that had been said to me. Nick was given a final warning and a write-up. The next couple of times I saw him, he would go on rants about how people were only there reporting him because they didn't like him. I assume he didn't know that I'd been questioned too, and neither Josh or I had any intention to tell him. He got so angry at one point that he practically was in tears, saying how lucky those cunts were that he was on his meds and what he would do to them if he wasn't. Luckily, it was about this point that the shift ended, and pretty much as soon as he clocked out, Josh told him that we had a lot of work to get done that night, so we didn't really have time to chat to him. He nodded and walked out the door, without another word. Josh wasn't lying, either. The truck had come extremely late that day, so there was still quite a bit of things that needed to be put on the shelf. One thing that the earlier shifts never seemed to do, unless they absolutely had to, was stocking up the drink coolers. It was true. That was easier to do at night when there are a lot less customers, so it was annoying since we couldn't chat, but we just went with it. Josh went into the drink cooler. It must have been pretty late since we had been there for a while at that point. I was still focused on stocking the shelves and making sure everything looked full if we didn't have it, when the bell chimed signalling someone had come in. I threw out a good evening and said I'd be right there, since anyone that came in that late usually only wanted a packet of cigarettes or to pay for the gas and cash. I put down my box and went to the registers, slowing dramatically once I could see them. You guessed it. There was Nick, not looking at me but leaning next to my register. I'd be lying if I said I had a reason to be afraid. It did turn out he was drunk, but I couldn't detect it right away from the smell of booze that always seemed to linger in the air around there, and Josh was right the other side of the wall. Even so, I considered for about 30 seconds if I should actually go, or if I should just run into the cooler and get Josh. Nick wasn't a young, fit guy or anything. Years of drugs and drinking had aged him prematurely and ruined his body, but he was still intimidating to a 20-year-old girl. Unfortunately, Nick made the decision for me. Probably tired of waiting, turned towards me, and that's when I noticed immediately that there was something off about him. My voice was nothing more than a pathetic whisper when I asked him what he wanted. He stared at me. Nothing on his face could tell me what he was thinking. I was about to speak again when he spoke, barely intelligible because of his slurring. "I leave you here alone." It took me a second to shake my head and tell him in a hopefully steady voice that Josh was in the cooler and asked if he wanted me to go and get him. Again, staring at me in silence. At this point, I didn't even care what he said. I just wanted him to say something. Silence was starting to creep me out. I asked him with more force in my voice, "What do you want, Nick?" As soon as I stopped speaking, he grinned at me, and in a disgusting, almost singing voice, he said, "You're lying. You're alone." He laughed and took a step toward me, but stumbled, allowing me to take several steps back. At this point I should have run to Josh. I should have called for him, anything, but I couldn't believe that I was reading the situation right. Nick was really weird, but I had never felt in actual danger around him before. He had never come off as more than a little unstable. He continued to come forward in slow, stumbling steps, telling me, "Come here. I just want to talk." I kept out of his reach, telling him to back off and that I would hurt him if I had to. He thought that was particularly amusing and laughed loud enough that it caught Josh's attention and caused him to look through the spaces in the racks to see what was going on. Josh was out the door in a second and seemed to come out of nowhere, shoving himself between Nick and I. They didn't even say anything, just stared each other down before Josh said in a stern tone, "I think you should leave now." Nick stared blankly for a moment and scoffed, telling us that we couldn't take a joke. I was trying not to cry at this point. The only thing more terrifying about the situation was knowing that if Josh hadn't been there and he had somehow caught me, I would have stood no chance against him. Josh left me standing with my back against the wall, corralling Nick to the door. Completely unexpected on both our parts, Nick turned and took a swing at Josh. Luckily, either because he was drunk or just really uncoordinated, he missed Josh's face, and Josh grabbed the back of his coat and brought him down as he smashed his knee into Nick's stomach or chest area, I'm not sure which, and used the opportunity of his spluttering to drag him to the door and throw him out, locking it. Josh had just turned and told me to call the cops as we heard a sickening crack behind him. We both jumped to look at the door to find this big circle of glass. It's hard to explain, but if you ever see a movie of one or an actual car wreck when something hits the windshield but not hard enough to break through and it turns all white at the point of impact, that's what the door looked like. Josh didn't even have to tell me what to do. This time I ran to the register and grabbed my phone, going to the corner farthest away from the door and huddled to the floor. I didn't even notice at the time. But Josh told me later that when he turned to see the glass, that was the first time that he noticed Josh had a hunting knife in his other hand. The fact that he had tried to punch Josh instead of stab him is a mystery and a miracle. I was sobbing when the operator picked up the phone. I don't know how she understood me. I was crying so hard. But between my distress and the sounds of Josh and Nick yelling at each other in the background with loud smashes of Nick hitting the door, she got the urgency of the situation. She asked me where I was, and luckily she knew the address, because just as I got up to look at the receipt to see what the address was, glass smashed. I dropped back to the floor and she told me that officers were already on their way and to do whatever I could to get away or hide, even if I had to leave Josh. The hole wasn't big enough for him to get through, and he had made it by grabbing the ashtray from outside and throwing it at the part of the window he had repeatedly punched, causing it to break through. From that hole he could reach the lock on the door. According to Josh, he walked to the door and put his mouth against the hole and said something that... I'm sobbing right now even thinking about it. In that horrible sing-song voice that he used the first time I talked to him that night. He said in such a happy tone, "They're never gonna find you two." Needless to say, as tough as he was acting, Josh was shitting bricks as much as I was. He was older than Nick, in his mid-30s, but he was a beanpole and wasn't exactly known for his fighting skills. Even so, as soon as Nick unlocked and started to open the door, Josh slammed his body into it, knocking Nick backward from the impact. Josh yelled at me to run, even though my legs felt like they would give out at any moment. I ran right behind him to the back doors. Nick was cursing and yelling at us. Josh slammed into the back door, cursing in pain as he realised it wouldn't open. Later we found out Nick had pushed the dumpster in front of the door, locking the wheels of it before he came in. We seemed to both realise this at once, that he actually planned to kill us. Nick rounded the corner, still doing that awkward stumbling walk, though faster now. It at least gave me time to slam the back room door shut and lock it. I was sitting in front of it, Josh bringing over anything he could find to barricade the door shut when Nick reached it. He must have heard me crying, because he kept calling my name, telling me that I wasn't who he wanted. He would make sure that I died before I even felt pain if I opened the door. He then just started stabbing at the door and screaming at me to open it. I screamed and moved when he stabbed at it the first time, but Josh and I both moved immediately to hold it shut again. I remember Josh and I making eye contact. We were both crying by now, and I wanted so badly to say something to comfort him, but I couldn't think of anything to say. I had dropped my phone when I ran out to hold the door shut, so neither of us could move to get it. So we had no idea of how long the police would take to get there, and the door was made of wood, so it wouldn't last long against his body slams and offering no protection if his knife went through one of our hands. All I could think about was that I was going to die here, that my dog would never know why I didn't come home, that I would never get my degree and have enough money to actually start enjoying life, and all the plans for the future that I had made would never happen. It was the most anticlimactic and wonderful finish ever that it just went silent. There were no police sirens, no yelling, nothing. It was as if Nick had just vanished. Josh and I looked at each other, not even daring to breathe, listening for any sign of life on the other side of the door. We both slammed to the ground when we heard a gunshot go off once, then twice, then a third time. Then there was more silence. Then a voice rang out, asking if anyone was here. We weren't sure if we should say anything. Then the voice continued with his name and that he was an off-duty EMT who had been listening to the scanner. Josh got up and pushed the things that we had used to block the door out of the way, opening it just enough to put his head out, and then it seemed like his breath just left him. He opened the door and went into the store, relief all over him. I ran and grabbed my phone, seeing that the call had disconnected or the dispatcher had hung up. When I went out into the store where Josh and our rescuer were, he was in the middle of explaining how the police over the scanner were sending a bunch of cars, but they were all pretty far away, and he had a horrible feeling that they wouldn't get there in time when the dispatcher was telling them what they'd find when they got there. He didn't want either of us to go outside until the police got there because, though Nick had been shot in the shoulder, he still had the knife when he took off. The EMT said he would have run after him, but with the state the store was in, he was scared that someone in here could be dying or hurt. The next 20 minutes were a blur. Josh and I were sitting on the floor hugging each other when the police got there. The EMT had called dispatch and told them of the new situation, and most of the cars that were coming to our location were diverted to looking for Nick. It was soon after that Josh got to use his phone to call his wife, and she came right over, only bringing their daughter because he begged her to. He seemed to completely break down when he held his daughter and hugged his wife. I had an extremely similar reaction when I finally got home and came to see my dog's body wiggling excitedly, proudly displaying his flamingo toy for me as his welcome home gift. Nick was found 2 weeks later in an old RV in the woods that he had been using to do his drinking and drugs in so that his wife wouldn't catch him. Apparently, the reason he had come after us was because he thought that the reason that Josh wanted him to leave so quickly was so that he could call the owner again, and this time the complaint would get him fired. Unknown to us, his wife had kicked him out 4 days before this happened and was in the process of getting a restraining order against him over threatening text and phone calls she'd been getting. He stated that his job was all that he had left, and Josh needed to be punished for trying to take that away from him. He said that I wasn't the target and he didn't want to have to kill me, but he knew that he had a much better chance of killing Josh with me there than Dixie, since Josh would be more likely to face him to protect me. Neither Josh or I called the owner or even the manager over his comments that night, though maybe we should have. It was disturbing what he was saying, in hindsight, but we were so used to him being creepy and saying really horrible things. At that point, it didn't even register to us that he could be serious about trying to hurt someone. I had known him for 3 months and Josh had known him for 6, and he had never done anything violent toward anyone. Everyone just thought he was all talk. We also put faith in the fact that every employee had a background check on them before they were hired, so it's not like Nick had ever been violent before. He took a plea deal, so that the 2 counts of attempted murder would be dropped and he could instead go to a mental hospital for offenders. The reason I'm writing this story now, other than the other stories on this sub inspiring me, is that I got a call 2 weeks ago notifying me that as long as there were no setbacks to his mental health, Nick is set to be released on the 8th of June this year. When I called Josh, he said he had received the same news the day before. Neither Josh or I work there anymore, and Josh has since moved away to another town on the other side of the city, and I have switched going to college completely online so that I'm in a new place and renting with a roommate. I don't think he'll come after either of us. I don't see how he could blame us for what happened. I read so many of these stories, and after the fact, everyone seems so prepared for what to do if they ever see the person they're writing about again. I don't think I'd be any more prepared to face him than I was back then. I've pretty much had intense nightmares ever since that day, but ever since I got that call, every time I close my eyes, all I can hear is that one sentence, louder and clearer than I have ever heard it since it was actually said. They're never going to find you two. If it was true that you were diagnosed as a psychopath, I hope you're getting the help you need. You already destroyed my peace of mind, and even now, years later, I don't feel safe, especially at night. I don't believe in God, but I pray to anyone that's listening that we never meet again.